Okay, hi everyone. My name is Deepi. I'm the moderator for this panel. Welcome to Unpacking Ableism. I am joined by the three fabulous panelists. We'll have each of them introduce them. So, panel number one, Aurora, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Aurora. I am a musician and activist. I'm also a journalist on the unceded Coast Salish territories of the Musqueams, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. I'm originally from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I'm autistic. So that is where I am coming from with my lens for this panel.
Craig, you're next.
Oh, hi there. Yes, I'm Greg Labine, also known as 77 Spokes, and I'm a rapper songwriter, and I've been doing it for over 25 years, approximately, quite a long time. Performed at various venues around Greater Vancouver area and recorded probably over 5 albums worth of material. And I do have bipolar disorder and also muscular dystrophy, so I've been using a wheelchair for my entire life. So that's my disability as well. Thank you.
And Amy?
Hi, friends. My name is Amy Amantea. I'm an access coordinator. I'm also an artist and performer and writer. I live with legal blindness, so that's my lens. And my pronouns are she, hers, joining you from the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh lands, colonially known as North Vancouver.
Okay, awesome. And again, my name is Deepi. I'm the moderator for this panel. A little bit about me. I'm a self-advocate. I have a rare and physical disability. I also work at UBC unceded territory of the Communum Musqueam people for CiTR and Disorder magazine. And outside of that, I'm a big advocate for accessibility awareness. So that's about me. So now we're just going to be asking I will be asking questions for the panel, and one by one, they will be giving me their thoughts to the questions. So my first question is, as artists, what were some challenges you faced accessing the nightlife before COVID? So, Aurora, do you want to answer that first?
Yeah, I also will just mention I forgot in my introduction that my pronouns are they, them. As far as this question goes, I think that prior to COVID, I really was becoming aware of how little accessibility is a focal point for people that are organizing events just kind of on a mainstream level. I really don't think that there was very much thought put into accessibility before at all, and I think that this pandemic has almost kind of been like a little bit of a blessing in that regard, in that we are kind of given this opportunity to see ways in which people weren't able to attend events before and kind of now have, like this panel as an example, or streamed events online and whatnot. Like there's people that are not able to attend these events without accessibility being something that is really implemented as one of the kind of like main focal points. And yeah, so that's, I mean, like I'm able-bodied. I'm not physically disabled, so I can imagine for somebody that is in a position of being physically disabled, like that, there's so many events that are just not even something that would be available for you to think about going to, because of the fact that that is just not made for you. So I imagine post-pandemic that a lot of these things are going to be more of a focal point and just like conversation starters and pieces, and I'm really grateful for that personally. But that being said, like as far as nightlife before COVID, I really feel like all of the opportunities that I have been afforded, I have either created for myself or been given to by other people who are also marginalized or disabled in some way. So that's what my thoughts on that are.
How about you, Craig? What's your thoughts?
So I think my what comes to mind before COVID and even years ago when I used to perform at nightclubs around Vancouver area and even in the outskirts of Vancouver, a lot of times there could be steps to get into the club or into the bar. So using a wheelchair, it was hard to perform at those venues or even to go watch other people. So even the immediate just getting in the building. And then a huge one is also the washrooms. It's always the washrooms. And I'm sure a lot of people that use a wheelchair like such as myself can probably relate to that because a lot of these venues don't have a wheelchair accessible washroom. And if they do have a washroom that's accessible, it's usually filled up with boxes and used as storage. So there'll be like beer bottles stacked up, like empty bottles in boxes, for example. And then you have to find a staff member at the club in order for them to move the boxes, and they have nowhere to move them. So they're moving them into the hall, which is blocking everybody else. So it just gets it's craziness. And there's some things that I had to do, which I won't repeat here, but you do what you have to do, and it's really quite a challenge in a lot of these clubs. Um, but I think one good place that I've been at recently is Roundhouse Community Center. I've performed there over the past few years with Vancouver Adapted Music Society and different other artists in the community, and they have like an accessible washroom that you can use that's got its own space and lots of room to move around for the chair. So there are places that do exist that do have these washrooms and fully accessible entrance and everything. So it does exist, but it's been hard to find over the years, in my experience.
I can definitely relate to you, Craig, when it comes to inaccessible washrooms. But I hope things get better. How about you, Amy? What's your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Deepi. Yeah, so my barriers to the nightlife are numerous. As a blind person, or I identify with blindness, but I have a small amount of partial. But it's not really great enough to, for example, find an address. So if I'm going to a space for the first time that I'm not familiar with, that's difficult. Once I'm in the space, lighting is often very low. So for somebody who has partial, lighting could be really important. I'm also very much using my ears to navigate through spaces. And let's be honest, nightclubs and bars are very noisy spaces. They're crowded with lots of people. So once I get inside, my navigation skills are pretty much useless. And then once I'm inside, finding an empty table, almost impossible. If you find an empty table, then finding the bar, finding the bathroom, reading the menus, those are all huge barriers. And so at the end of the day, sometimes I think to myself, gosh, I actually can't do this by myself. And it's a sad realization because I'm a very independent person, but when it comes to accessing nightlife, it's quite a difficult thing to be able to do. And folks in the biz are just not aware of accessibility for folks who live with blindness.
Thank you so much, Amy. And thank you, everyone. So my next question, I know from a personal experience when I was applying for a job, I had to make sure I wasn't making more than what my job required as far as benefits, like disability benefit support goes. So with that, do you feel that the government discourages diverse people from finding jobs? And this is a two-part question, so I'll ask the next part after. So, Greg, let's start with you.
Okay, sure. I can remember it was a number of years ago now, actually, but I was on disability assistance from the government, and I was actually on it for a number of years as well. But there was a point where I was working as well. I was working part time, and you could only make $800 a month at your job, and then anything more than that, you wouldn't be able to keep because you were staying on the disability. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm saying it correctly actually, but basically you could only make about $800 a month, which is still good that we could do that and still be on assistance. And I'm not complaining because the fact that we even have that option to be on disability is really great. And I know it helped me, but it does discourage having the job with that whole situation. And then I was able to find a full time job. And so I just went off of the assistance. And then from there, it's transitioned into other jobs and just staying at that full time or enough of a part time that like I was able to survive without being on assistance up until now. So that's what I've experienced.
How about you, Amy? What's your thoughts?
I think it's really problematic for folks who identify as any type of artist. Oftentimes, artists are part of the gig economy. And so, for myself in particular, I find as an artist that oftentimes, sometimes I have a lot of work going on and sometimes I have no work going on. And so, what's problematic for me is that it feels like there's a threat. It feels like if you work too much, the benefits will disappear. And so what's the incentive to keep trying to find work if you come to a point where you're just at that borderline where enough work is enough to throw you off benefits, but not enough to sustain you financially in a city like Vancouver. And so it kind of feels a little bit like a loose threat. And I'd love to see a model based more around a guaranteed income or just a system where we recognize that folks with disabilities have additional barriers. And so, for example, benefits should be less about maybe living requirements and more about, what are the things that I need to mitigate my barriers? So, for example, a screen reader for somebody who's blind could cost about $1,000. A CCTV monitor to read my mail for low vision costs $4,500. And so having supports that are geared more around those that you don't have to apply for, but just allowing the system to give you supports because you have these additional barriers might be a model that we could consider looking at and is less tied to, being able to pay your rent and paying your bills and eating, because I would hate for people to sacrifice their artistic practice because they're right on that borderline.
And Aurora, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I really, really relate very deeply to what Amy just said. As an artist who I'm late diagnosed with autism. I've obviously living with it my whole life, but I was not able to get any support for that until quite late into my 20s. And so I've been in a position of having to make the decision of whether or not I am able to make the sacrifices that I would have to make in order to get on disability to get that support. And unfortunately, it's not really even a possibility for me to do at all, just because of the fact that I am lucky to be high functioning, as they say, and also quite independent. But yeah, like for the most part, I would say the government definitely discourages people that are not within the able-bodied, neurotypical sort of range of experiences. So yeah, my experience has definitely been a little bit difficult in that I have been trying to balance figuring out how to navigate being an autistic person in the music industry and also trying to navigate being an artist. And it does seem that it is a little bit difficult in that I imagine this is a problem in most art scenes and communities and not just within the music industry, but yeah, there's definitely not a lot of space that is made for differently abled experiences. So yeah, hopefully that changes soon though.
So my third question, do you feel that the local government is doing enough to make the communities more inclusive and accessible for everyone? If not, what would you like to see improve? We'll start with Amy first, please.
Thanks, Deepi.
Yeah.
You know, the Accessible British Columbia Act is pending, and so we'll see if any difference is made there. I think for me, some of the biggest things are, once we make stuff accessible, there's no way set up right now, no efficient way, I should say, that's set up so that you can complain if something isn't accessible. And so that becomes for me a barrier as a human that's accessing whatever I want to access. Because if I find these barriers, I can't just simply, I have no recourse to mitigate them in terms of, you know, the government, how the government has organized these things. And again, you know, the work that I do often in the arts and with municipalities, oftentimes we forget about blind folk. And I really, it disheartens me to say that out loud, but we don't think about accessible signage. We don't think about, audible crossing signals where it'll tell me what street I'm at. We don't think about tactile pavers for street crossings, and all of those things are navigable in the built environment for me to be able to get to a venue. Then once I get to a venue, it's like nobody thinks about a braille or a large print menu. Nobody thinks about these kinds of things. And a lot of them are, you know, in terms of menus, for example, that's a really, really small kind of low-hanging fruit thing with accessibility in order to just make the myriad of restaurants and clubs and bars more accessible for folks who live with blindness or partial sight. So even if we just start small and we move in a forward momentum along the continuum, that is a place that I would love to see folks being. Recognize where we are on that continuum and make a commitment to move forward.
And Aurora, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that there's always going to be more work to be done to make communities more inclusive and accessible for everyone. I can, like, as an autistic person, I think that there's very, very little space made for the acceptance of neurodiverse experiences. And I mean, that can be reflected back. That's a great example of that is the downtown east side. A good amount of those people suffer from all kinds of mental health disorders and are oftentimes neurodiverse. So, I mean, I don't think that there is a lot of support for anybody that isn't kind of in the main lens of people that exist within a community. And I think that, you know, a big part of that is colonization. So I think that making space for disabled people of all kinds and of all different lenses and with all different experiences and contributions to communities, I think that that is going to be one of the most important focal points of decolonizing our communities. So I don't think that the government is doing enough. And I think that what we are going to need to do in order to see more done is create space at these tables where these decisions are being made that include disabled people. We need people in wheelchairs. We need blind people. We need neurodiverse people. We need people that have these experiences to be able to speak on them. And, you know, like when Amy just described her experience of trying to navigate the city as a person with vision impairment, those are things that I don't necessarily think about automatically as somebody that doesn't have vision impairment. So if you're making all of these decisions as like a I don't know, city council or whatever it is, and there's nobody on your city council that has any of these experiences to base their lens on, I mean, it's almost impossible for them to be able to create these sorts of accessible, inclusive community values and things that everybody can benefit from. So
That's a really good point, Aurora, you're making. Like, if you're not someone with a disability on the council, then it's like they won't understand or they won't think about these things. It's almost like someone has to be on the council in order for everyone to start thinking about new ways to make it easier for everyone. So that's a good point. How about you, Craig? Do you have any thoughts or say about this?
Just a little bit maybe. I think uh, for people in chairs, we run into a lot of barriers. There's a lot of work to be done, as Aurora said, and I think we have come a long way, of course, from back in the day. Of course, if you compare to the years ago, it's getting better, but and I still feel like I kind of appreciate what we do have. I think most doors have buttons now wherever you go. We got the ramps and the sidewalks. We got different accessibility that's becoming more common, but there's also some places that are a little bit frustrating. Like I find when I go on the SkyTrain, they just have this little corner seat that you can flip up and back in with your wheelchair, and it's not nearly enough space. And then people try to sit down and fold the seat down beside you to squeeze in there in rush hour because it's so busy. And so you're barely having any space, especially with COVID. But I don't even really go on the SkyTrains these days, or even for the past year with COVID. But the SkyTrain is frustrating. And then they even have these new trains where there's a bar all along the side so you can pull up with your chair, but they're actually meant for bikes. So even with this new way, it's not even really for us. It's for bikes, and a lot of times bikes will pull up and take up the whole rail. So we end up sitting right in the middle by the pole, and people are brushing past us, knocking into us, coming and going, and we're just like sitting in the middle, like we're on display, and we have nowhere to just kind of sit and relax like a normal seat in a SkyTrain. So they should figure something out for that. It's just so silly to me. But that's just one thing because I used to take the train every day to work to and from. But let's see. Yeah, basically the for artists, I think it's important to be able to express yourself, and there should be more funding for people with disability, artists with disabilities, to be able to um, have a chance to work on their craft or learn what it means to be a rapper, learn what it means to be a singer, a painter, a sculptor, whatever the art is. Like, if you have a disability, you should have that option to get into it and learn about it. And there should be funding available and adaptations as needed for those opportunities. Because I know for myself, with expressing myself through my songwriting over the years and rapping, it's been huge for me to be able to have that creative outlet. It's helped keep me sane through so much different turmoil for various things I've gone through. It's just helped me out a lot. So I think more funding and more availability of like awareness of what's out there and opportunities to become available for artists with disabilities or people that are interested in it.
Well said. I could totally relate to you, Craig, when you talked about SkyTrain and how it's inaccessible for someone who's using a wheelchair. Because yeah, I've had similar situations where I was close to the doorway, and then you feel like you're in the way for someone to get in, but that's the only space that you can really park. And then you can't park where the bike aisle is, because that's for the bikes or even strollers. So I
Yeah.
totally understand. Yeah. Does anybody else like to add more? Okay.
This is
So have
Amy
you?
speaking. Sorry, Deepi, I just would like to say that the government can do a lot, but we can also do a lot as human beings when we just think about being inclusive for the folks that are in our communities. So we don't have to wait for the government to make a ruling or to put in legislation. We can address things that are right in front of us.
Yeah, and I agree with that too, Amy. But I think also it's not just us. I think it's that as a community, if you have the community support around you, because I know that if more people don't speak up, then the government might not respond quick enough. So it's a community more that needs to bring awareness. So that's a really good point. And Craig, like you said, yeah, it's come a long way, I think, as well. But yeah, it doesn't hurt to try even more and more so that the future is brighter for everyone. So thank you for that one. And my fourth question is, have you ever faced ableism in the music industry or at a workplace? And if so, how did you react? So Aurora, let's go with you first.
Okay. This is an interesting one for me because, like I said, I am coming from a lens of, I guess, really like having to unpack my own internalized ableism, having grown up, having fallen through the cracks of being able to understand what my experience was until I was a full grown adult. So I think a lot of what I have experienced throughout my time as an artist and navigating the music industry was ableism, and I didn't even realize that it was happening at the time because of my own lens of coming from this kind of, like privileged, mostly able-bodied place and not seeing myself in that disabled lens. And since that's been changing for me, and I'm really, starting to navigate how ableism is really, like we have all of these isms, there's racism and there's all of these other things, but as far as the insidiousness of ableism goes, I don't think that a lot of people realize just like how deep it is in all of our everything about our communities and the way that they're set up. And so I guess what I've experienced the most is, like getting involved with organizations that are mostly straight, white, able-bodied people, or being asked to play a music event or something like that, and then being faced with having to, I guess, sort of like manipulate my own experience to fit with however these people want this event to go, or like, you know what I mean, however their organization is running. So I've really felt like I've been accused of being unreliable, or like all of these different things. I can, there's just a whole list of things that I can imagine are even doubled and tripled for people that have more severe physical disabilities, and more also just like noticeable disabilities as well, because that's, like, I think that a big thing I've been thinking about a lot is, as somebody that has been organizing dance music events and trying to create safer space nightlife events for people, one of like, nobody thinks about where can we find a venue so that everybody is involved. It's kind of just like, oh, okay, we found this venue and there's a bunch of stairs here, so it's not accessible, sorry. But then it's like, okay, so you know, even in just like in this online room, there's half of the people are in wheelchairs. So that would mean that like that's 50% of people in this space that would be unable to attend an event that has stairs. And that's just kind of like, I feel like accessibility is thought of as something that is just like a secondary thing. It's like, oh yeah, we should be doing this. It's not like we need to be doing this. This is important. You know, like I think that if it's about inclusivity, it's going to include everybody. And that's what's missing. That's what's missing is like, you know, disabled people are viewed as lesser than. And that's also coming from that colonized lens. It's like, oh, you weren't born as you should have been born, so your value is less. That's the way that it's viewed. So, I mean, I think that ableism in the music industry is like on such a deep level that for people that don't even consider themselves disabled, it's happening as well. It's just like this really pervasive sort of thing that almost is part of what drives the music industry in a way. So yeah, that's kind of my lens on it.
Craig, what do you have to say?
I think, wow, that's pretty heavy and true, Aurora. I'm with you there. And I just think of long ago when there were people in wheelchairs or people with disabilities who weren't even able to go out. So they were just stuck in their homes. And now maybe people still view it like that. They're like, oh, well, he's lucky to even have a life. He's lucky to even be able to go out and have a part-time job doing what he does. And anything else would be just extra, like, but it shouldn't be that way. It should be inclusive. So I fully agree with what you're saying there. And what I was going to mention as well is just when it comes to recording studios, and like I said with the venues, it's really the washrooms right now that's on my mind because I've experienced it so much. And not only the washrooms, but getting into the studios. Like most of the recording studios are not fully accessible, and the washroom, no chance. So you're really spending like 2 or 3 hours recording some songs, and you need water to stay hydrated. And then, you know what I'm saying? Like it's really impossible. So you have to find alternate ways to manage things, and it's a bit rough when it comes to that, and venues as well. So recording studios, and again, like I said last time, there are certain places that are better. Like for example, I know Warehouse Studio has a pretty accessible setup. But again, you know, it's only certain people that could perhaps afford Warehouse, or, you know, I'm not saying that it's wrongly priced or anything. It's an amazing studio, but I'm just saying a lot of the more other studios that are available don't have that. So, but it's good that some of them do, and I guess we're working on it.
Amy, do you have anything say to this?
Boy, do I ever.
Please do.
I mean, I totally sympathize with what Aurora is saying and what Greg is saying. And one of the things, one, two, three, four of the things that I experience all the time around ableism is the idea of inspiration porn. That somehow, because I was able to put my clothes on this morning, that I am some sort of inspiration. How do blind people cook their meals? Oh my gosh, if you can cook a meal, I can cook a meal. My life could be so much worse. I'm going to appreciate my own life because your life is worse than mine. I come across that all the time. Microaggressions, which I'm also working on myself in terms of ableist microaggressions and trying to remove them from my lexicon of language. And I don't want to be the language police or anything, but sometimes folks without disabilities will say to me something like, well, we all have something, right? And in my heart of hearts, I think to myself, really, when you break your toe, that's inconvenient. But folks with disabilities are living their lives with day-to-day barriers and barriers to the day-to-day functioning of life. And we also have a lot of real systemic considerations to disability that I think have been forgotten about. We talk about them a lot. Other equity seeking groups often talk about systemic barriers and systemic issues. And for example, institutionalization of people with disabilities, forced sterilization and eugenics of people with disabilities. So that all comes from our history. And so when you start to say things like, well, we all have something, when somebody says to me, oh, when I take off my glasses, I'm blind too. And when you're tired of the game, you get to put the glasses back on. And so oftentimes what I experience is microaggressions of that nature. And microaggressions at their core are sort of seemingly dated, when somebody says, the blind leading the blind, or I'm blindsided, or your concerns are falling on deaf ears. They feel they're so part of our fabric of common language that people throw them out constantly, but nobody considers the death by 1,000 paper cuts to the individual who hears that every day, all day, and what that does to my own self-worth and my own internalized ableism of what the world thinks that I should or could be able to function, and how I could or should perform a job. And those sort of assumptions, those ableist assumptions and attitudes are the biggest barriers for me. How can you possibly use a computer? We can't hire a blind person. They can't use a computer. Well, let me show you how I do it, right? So I think there's a lot of barriers that exist, but I think the attitudinal barriers, the assumptions, and the microaggressions that, again, I'm also working hard to remove things like dumb and stupid and crazy. I'm trying to remove those from my lexicon, because for some folks, there are profound impacts on their own self-worth and their relationship to their disability. And so I don't need to use them, but it is a hard thing to do because they're everywhere. We've been using them for a long time, but there are huge systemic relationships to that kind of language. So I think, that's all work that we're asked to do. In every equity seeking group, we're asked to think about language, to think about aggressions, to think about, in the disability community, to think about access. And I think about accessibility in general, part of the physical environment, also part of the social construct, just human beings in a community together. There's no finish line, right? We're not rushing to a finish line. We're all on this continuum together. And again, I've said it before, if you can recognize where you are on that continuum and make a firm commitment to move forward every day, even if it's small steps, we will all be better for it.
Well said, Amy. That was perfectly said. Thank you for that. Anybody else like to add more? Okay. So my next question is, so have you ever noticed music venues being inclusive for those who are either people with disabilities and in the LGBTQ2 plus community? This is a two-part question, so I'll just ask that part. So we'll go with Amy on this.
Yeah, I can't say that I've noticed a huge amount of inclusivity, but I think it's probably because my own barriers to just getting out to music venues, into the nightclubs and things like that have been large. And so oftentimes I don't participate in those things unless I'm with a group of folks. And when I'm with a group of folks that I know, that I love, that are my people, it doesn't matter what intersectionalities they come from, they're included in our circle. And so, I do know that, there's always slangs that I hear. And a part of what I'm trying to do as my own work is, when I hear them, to address them instead of just letting them slide. And it sort of goes back to the microaggressions sort of statement I made earlier. So, if I have a friend in my circle who doesn't identify with gender, or is using they them pronouns, and somebody misgenders them, or uses, then without being the performative allyship champion, so I don't want to embarrass anybody in my circle, but I think it is important for us to sort of nip that in the bud when we see it, right? To just remind folks in a way that, oh, you know, my friend so-and-so uses they, them pronouns, or to just change the sentence and address them that way so folks around you sort of learn that through osmosis. But other when we see these aggressions happening in a way that still gives autonomy to that individual. And it's a hard thing to do. There's no doubt about that. It's a continuous work in process. And as a blind person, some of those things mean that I can't necessarily, air quotes, see who made the statement. And so I don't want to, you know, teach somebody who is doing things the appropriate way because they are not the ones who misgendered, for example. So that as doing my own work, it's like, okay, well, who in my space actually do I need to address, because I can only hear them, I can't see them. And that doesn't always make the most reliable witness or the most reliable ally. But it is work that I'm continuously doing on for all of my friends in equity seeking groups, because I want to be their allies and I want them to be my ally. So I think that's work we can all, you know, we can all choose to develop in our own lives.
Craig, do you have anything to say?
Yes, I think I would just go back to what I mentioned earlier. There are certain venues that do include people with disabilities. They have that in mind. But like that one that I had mentioned earlier, the Yaletown Community Center, is where we've done some shows. The Roundhouse Community Center, and the shows that I've done there, they have more than one washroom available, and that's been good. And they have full accessibility to get in the building, and so it is good. Everything, it works out. There's no stairs or anything like that. And I know there must be other clubs and other places. I'm only saying that one a lot because I performed there a number of times, but I also haven't really performed in over a year or maybe a year and a half because of COVID. So I don't really know about the a lot of the clubs nowadays, or the bars that people are performing at, the venues. I'm not really sure what what is really up to par out there right now, or what's inclusive. So there probably are more that should be added to that list, but that's one that comes to mind. But hopefully there'll be more venues that are inclusive in the near future.
Thanks, Craig. How about Aurora? Do you have any say on this question?
Yeah. Thanks, Deepi. I honestly don't feel like there are that many accessible venues, and I have been, for like before COVID, I was spending a lot of my time researching and trying to find DIY venues within the city in order to hold just like events that, you know, like when you're trying to hold like a safer space event that is specifically for LGBTQ people, not even from a lens of disability, just coming from that lens. I find that trying to do so in a commercial space tends to be not always the best, just because there tends to be, you know, there could be just like organizational oppression. There could be just policies of that organization that might not actually be reflective of an inclusive space. So, yeah, in my experience, finding spaces in order to do that is really the only way. And if I can think back of during COVID, I think the first time I really was like shocked, because I was like, whoa, like this is a really like inclusive event. And it was Vancouver Mural Fest and Public Disco's pop-up events that they did, which were outside, which were, you know, like on flat ground. And like that, they were accessible. Those were accessible events. But like for the most part, I really don't think that any of our institutions that are kind of like already standing and existing are really like, they're not for us. They're not for disabled people. They're just not. So I think that a lot of how I guess we just really have to kind of keep having these conversations, as Amy was saying, and just kind of like talk to our peers that might not necessarily understand why these things are so important, and kind of like opening up the dialogue with people that do have maybe a little bit more of a power dynamic in these kinds of situations of making these decisions, and just kind of like saying, hey, maybe it would be cool if we had a conversation about how we can make this somewhere where everybody is able to go. Because like, I personally have been feeling really just kind of like pretty upset over the last year over all the virtue signaling that has been happening, not just for disabled people, but for Black people, like for everyone. Just like every group that's looking for equity, it's like, okay, everyone sees that now, but it seems like there's still a lot of people that are just kind of doing the work to make it seem like they're doing the work. And you know, it's kind of like, how do we change that? How do we make it so that we can actually have inclusivity, not just on paper, but in reality as well? And so, yeah, I think that just continuing to have conversations is the answer. But I don't personally feel like there are a lot of inclusive venues for people with disabilities that are also in the LGBTQ community. And yeah, it's just kind of the reality of it right now.
So you kind of already touched on this, but my second question to number 5 is, how can society become more educated about these social issues rather than advocates having to be their teachers? So, Amy, do you want to start first?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, I'd just like to give a shout out for unisex bathrooms, because I think that they're one of the most inclusive things that we can do, but also great for accessibility if they're accessible bathrooms. And as a blind person, I can't tell you how many times I've gone into what's considered a male identifying bathroom and not the female identifying bathroom. So let's just remove and make every bathroom unisex. Okay, Greg, there you go. There's my shout out to bathrooms. So your question, Deepi, around what folks can do, how we educate folks. My heart tells me that a lot of this is about representation. If we don't have folks with disabilities, or again, any equity seeking group, but we're here about access primarily. If we don't have folks with disabilities in our spaces, we forget about them. And the default is always a white able-bodied space. That's been my experience. So it's a white able-bodied space until Amy enters the room. Then when Amy enters the room, sometimes people are like, oh, what can we do to help Amy? But when I'm not in the room, nobody thinks about that. And so we need to be present in employed spaces, in educational spaces. We also need to be present in arts in terms of being like on stage, backstage, on film, on screen. When we tell and share our authentic stories, populations that don't identify with disability aren't so afraid of us. And I think that's a part of it. I think, a lot of able-bodied folks are afraid to reach out. They're afraid to offer assistance. They're afraid that they don't know where to start. And I think that those of us with disabilities can do a lot in terms of just leading by example. And I don't always want to be somebody's teachable moment, but it is the career that I have chosen. It is what I do as a human being that lives with a disability. And I get that not everybody wants to do that. And I absolutely support your choices in that. But I think, for me, I try and do accessibility by example. So I work on my language. I work on being in inclusive spaces. I work on, you know, when I host a meeting, I make sure that I ask about access needs, for example. Even if I know that there's nobody in the room that identifies with disability, there's no reason that I shouldn't be asking about access needs for the group at large, because we know that not everybody with a disability wants to disclose that they have a disability, and that everybody has access needs, whether it is a bathroom break or a meal break. It's just that usually if you're able-bodied, your access needs are part of the default. And that's really where I think we can make some change, is by recognizing what that default is, and by having representation of folks with disabilities in our spaces. And that, again, like it beautifully ties right into access, right? So if we're not welcome in a space, we're not going to be in a space. And so this sort of continuing cycle. So that's the work that I try and do with folks, is help guide them through that process, so that it doesn't feel so daunting, so that they can start to use what I call their accessibility muscle, their brain. If you don't use the muscle, you lose the muscle. But if you start to use the muscle and recognize things around you that are non-inclusive and non-accessible, you can be a great ally, and you don't need to be educated about it.
Very well said, Amy. Craig, what's your thoughts on this?
My thoughts are definitely aligned with Amy on some points there about like representation in the arts and on stage and things like that. I think that's a huge way. And as well, even what Aurora said earlier about sitting on the boards and being part of the decision making and having people with disabilities as part of that process. But as for the arts, like I've worked with some theater companies that do it really well, like Real Wheels and Theater Terrific. Um, and there's also just being in movies, like, but the unfortunate thing is that in these movies, a lot of times, the person, for example, that's in a wheelchair, if we use that type of disability, they're not really a wheelchair user. They're actually an able-bodied person, and they're just acting. And so we need more people that are literally disabled playing those roles, and more like rappers like me and singers and all the arts. And once people start hearing and seeing that, and it's, I don't know if normalize is the right word, but just like make it a regular thing where they're hearing our stories, they'll understand us. And I know this is a lot of what Amy was saying, but I fully agree with that. And I just think the more we get out there, have people speaking in public, like wherever those opportunities are, and if people will listen, then it will be more on the front of their mind.
Very well said, Craig. I couldn't agree with you more, because if you're an actor and you are able-bodied and you're playing a disabled character, it would just make sense for someone who actually has a disability, because you don't have to do all the research. The person themselves know how, like, you know, like they can understand. So it I don't know. I think it's getting better, but I think it's a long haul still with the entertainment industry. So, Aurora, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, I think that's such an excellent point that you made, Greg, and just like thinking to a couple of months ago in the music industry, there's an artist named Sia. Maybe you all heard of her or not. She's quite popular. I think she's from the UK, but she created this like music video / film in which she had the main character cast was meant to be autistic, but it was an autistic person that was casted. It was just a able-bodied, you know, just like neurotypical person that was casted to act as an autistic person. So what ended up happening is, you know, like a lot of people saw this and they thought, oh, wow, this is so inspirational. But all of these autistic people were like, oh, this is like really just highlighting all of these like really, really negative stereotypes and all of these things that perpetuate this misunderstanding of what neurodiversity and autism is, and really just kind of, you know, perpetuating this treating like treating disabled people as lesser than, to the point where you can't even, like, this stuff goes back way, way, way back into the time of slavery, when slaves first got nominally freed in the States. Blackface was the thing that actually pushed forward performance on a stage. So really, like, all of this stuff is coming from such a cracked foundation that it's like we really don't have any other choice but to just, like, like, it's one thing to hope that people are going to create space at the table for you, but really, like, the only way that we're really going to continue to see any big changes that are beneficial to the people that really need to see them are by creating our own tables. And I mean, obviously that's happening, but I think that as far as your question about how can society become more educated about these issues, I think, as Amy was saying, like, continuing to have the courage to talk about these things and to speak with people that aren't coming from these lenses and that do have the privilege of not living with these different barriers within the disabled experience. And something that I've really been thinking a lot about lately, and has also been a little bit of a common conversation, kind of just like within the Twitter realm and whatnot in the electronic music community, is access and accessibility riders and documents for artists. And what this is it's basically like, you as a disabled person, you have a list of things that are basically just boundaries for you that are going to determine whether or not you're able to provide your service or art or whatever it is that you're doing at an event. And I think that this could be a really, really, really beneficial step if disabled artists start doing this, because I think what will start to happen is non-disabled people will start to see why these things are so important, and it will maybe create some sort of opportunity for working relationships between, like, allies and people with barriers that are trying to navigate the music industry. And even beyond that, like, like, I know of people that are white in the music industry that are now putting on their rider saying, like, I won't play at this venue if there's anything transphobic, or I won't play at this venue if there's not accessible bathrooms, things like that. So I think that these sorts of, like, little steps in solidarity are what are really going to cause big change for this industry.
Thanks so much, Aurora. Well said. And I heard about Sierra, or Sierra too. Like, she really got bad rap on that, but like, why not just hire someone who actually was autistic? Like, I have no idea why they didn't think of that. But hopefully they learned a lesson. And if you want to do a movie, please do hire someone with a disability. It's that simple. Okay, so not everyone is in this, like, not everyone is the same, and some people work better in certain environments. For example, some folks do better with less stimulation. How can we shift the cultural perspectives on disability so that everyone is embraced and lives to their full potential? And Craig, we'll start with you first.
I think it's just keeping in mind the variety of differently abled people when we're putting something together, like a show or a venue, or when there's some type of event happening. Just keeping all of those people in mind, keeping all of us in mind, and just trying to create something from the ground up, and just really uh, think about what's needed for each of us individuals, and then work towards that. And having people like us around for input would be really good too. I think that's all I can really think of right now.
Well said. Aurora?
Yeah, I agree with Greg, and I think that also just like maybe some of the sorry, my camera's being weird. Maybe some of the what we are viewing as barriers in society that have been caused by COVID-19, you know, like just not being able to gather and to go to venues for the most part. I think like a lot of that can be maybe like flipped to be a sort of positive thing for disabled people. In like, for example, like when everything starts to open back up again, we are, you know, finding venues for events. And say, for example, there's an event where something isn't accessible, there's stairs, or there's just like it's not accessible for somebody that's in a wheelchair, for example. And I want to have Greg perform at my event, but it's not accessible for him. Well, maybe it can be planned out by these organizers now that, you know, like some time can be put into like doing a recording of that person's performance. That's not, you know, like just, I think that creating just like new opportunities instead of saying, oh, I'm sorry, this isn't accessible for you, it's not an opportunity for you then. I think instead of, you know, just jumping to that conclusion and looking for other ways that can be implemented into making it accessible for people is a good way that we can start to kind of shift that cultural perspective and like also just realize like, I mean, like from the example of rave culture, and really even just like any music event, like music is about bringing people together. Music is a, you know, like we go out and listen to music and we experience that because we're trying to connect, whether it be with ourselves or with other people. So you should see several different people at your event. There shouldn't just be straight able-bodied people. There shouldn't just be people that are able to walk. There shouldn't just be people that are all able to see what's going on in the way that is being presented. You know, like all of these things just, it just shouldn't even like be something that people have to think about. But unfortunately, we are still just, as we said earlier, like coming from this lens of not being as valuable as people that are not coming from a lens of disability. So yeah, I think that that's really what has to change is the fact of viewing disabled people and viewing disability as just being a barrier, because it's not just a barrier, it's a different experience. We're differently abled people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that what we experience has to be a barrier if our society and our communities are accommodating our needs. Because I mean, really, like that's really all it is. Like poverty is a barrier until you're given the support and the resources that you need to not be poverty anymore. And I think that it kind of just like, I don't know, it goes for everything. Like you don't tell somebody that they should change the way that they, you know, you don't tell people that they should change the way that they're dressing and stuff like that, because, you know, it's the same thing for disability, but on a deeper level, because this is just coming down to like how people exist in the world. And I think we've been like viewing these things as like, oh, you know, it's like an accessory to your experience, your disability, and also just kind of like sometimes a hindrance to the normal reality and the normal experiences that people want to have. And that's what needs to change, because it's not. We're all just, you know, like we all just live our lives and we're just trying to connect with one another. And I think that in order for everyone to reach their full potential, we need to be creating this society where everybody is an ally to everybody, as Amy kind of said before. I think that's the key.
Amy, do you have a thoughts on this?
How do we change the cultural perspective? I
Mm-hmm.
think we're doing it right now. I think we do it by changing the narrative. I think we do it by addressing tropes of disability. The work has already begun. And I think that, you know, we have to be impassioned to continue this work. It's too easy to give up. Like, it's really, really easy. It's daunting work, and it's all, the onus has always been on the person with the disability to do that work. And changing cultural, for me, changing the cultural perspectives around disability is also how I view myself as a person with a disability. And I'm not trying to oversimplify that, but I was a person that identified with sight for the first 24 years of my life. And for the last 15 years of my life has been a non-sighted person. So I know what it's like to make that transition. I know what it's like to have a foot in both worlds. But I now look at my sight loss as a gift. It's a gift that has put me in spaces with folks that I would never have been in spaces with. And I want to use whatever privilege that I have to be able to make some kind of systemic change. And that's going to take a long time, folks. Let's be honest. That is continuous work. Again, there's no finish line. We just keep moving forward on the continuum. And so the cultural change for me is about changing the narrative. And as soon as we start to look at folks with disabilities as folks that are talented and vibrant and offer our communities great benefits and gifts, we won't ever be able to change that cultural perspective while we're still considered the objects of pity. You know, unfortunately, and media has a large part to play in that, but unfortunately, that is the public perception. And I change that by folks that I'm in environments with every day, that I'm in environments with them, one person at a time. Because I truly believe that if I can represent myself as a person with a disability who is you know, well-spoken, who is intelligent, who is capable of getting the work done, that's good for everybody in our community, right? And it you know, again, oversimplifying the issue, I realize, but I really try and do that because I think it's for betterment of the perception of non-disability identifying folks, to be able to be in spaces with folks with disabilities that are doing the work.
So in other words, we can say that do contact Amy or Craig or Aurora or even me for any accessibility talks, right? We can say that.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I'm open for that. Yeah. So that wraps up for the questions, but I just want to leave something for everyone to think about when leaving. I would like to leave you all with you know, where, like, whenever the I'll start that again. I'm just gonna have everyone to think about this, and whatever the return of the normalcy happened and whatever it may look like, how can we do better in making events more accessible and inclusive for everyone, to think positively so that no one is excluded or feels like ableist, because we are all equal and deserve opportunities. And I think that pretty much sums up what we've all talked about. But do you want to add anything, Aurora, Craig, or Amy? Yeah, Amy.
Yeah, I think I would just like to add that I think, you know, coming out of the pandemic, certainly the pandemic has had silver linings in terms of identifying the gaps within accessibility. Now, those of us who are equity seeking folks in the disability community have known these gaps for eons, but they've started to become a mainstream consideration. So for example, you know, forever and a day, I was told, well, you can't work from home. We're not set up to do that. Oh, look how fast the world rallied for folks to work at home, right? Same thing with education. So I think, you know, in this new post-pandemic reality, I would really like to see this hybrid approach continuing. And I'm hearing a lot of that from my friends in the disability community, certainly a lot of that from folks in the blind community who have found, and again, this digital platform's not perfect, but have found the ability to connect from all over the world and to build community that way as well. And I think by proxy, that makes our voice even louder. Because I think, to be honest with you, my feeling around the disability community, if you compare what we do in Canada to what they do in the United States, we don't rally the same way. You know, we don't show up on our parliament buildings and rally like they did for the 504 movement, if anybody saw Crip Camp, right? Like it doesn't seem to be part of Canadian culture for us to stir waves like that. We're really like, oh, sorry, I had to ask for an access need. Sorry about that. And I think if we start to connect with folks around the world in the disability community through these digital platforms, that will start to change. We'll start to be able to learn from each other on how we can maybe best support our communities around the world in, you know, creating a more accessible and inclusive space for us all. So that would be my final thoughts. And to invite folks to do the work, invite folks to join us at the table and bring us into your tables. Let's just continue the dialogue, because if we stop the dialogue, we can't ever possibly move forward.
Well said. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for participating. It was really well chatting with all of you, and thank you
Thanks,
for
Deepi.
our audience to for sticking around, and we hope you came out with something from this panel. And again, thank you so much.
Thanks, Deepi.
Thank you, and thank you so
Thanks,
much
yeah.
for hosting.
Yeah, no worries.
Thanks, friends.